New Year's Eve 2012 was the first time many Americans discovered surge pricing. People were shocked when their taxi ride home was $135, having expected it to be only $27. Some thought it was a computer glitch, but it was the normal functioning of Uber's algorithm. When the algorithm detects that demand is high, it increases taxi prices. Outside big events like New Year's Eve, you might see Uber at 1.4 or 1.8 times the usual price. During big events, it can go up to 5 times the usual price, and even higher multiples have been observed. People generally see this as annoying and unfair. But are their feelings justified? Uber defends its surge pricing algorithm on the grounds that it leads to better outcomes for drivers and for customers. In this video, I want to investigate the good and the bad of surge pricing. Surge pricing is a symbol of an economy where prices and wages are increasingly variable. This contrasts with more traditional economic arrangements where they were relatively stable for long periods of time. How did this transition happen? Do we want it to happen? We'll need to learn a bit more about how Uber works to find out.
I understand, and I'm sorry for being rude. No, you've explained the economics of running a rural taxi firm very clearly. 3 hours for a cab.
How are we going to get back?
Uber is often sold as the triumph of ideas from Economics 101. Through its surge pricing, it brings markets into balance. Economics pundits and economists sometimes verge on the evangelical about the company. But this misses so many of the issues raised by surge pricing. Dynamics of the economy and behaviors that don't fit Economics 101. Reasons that people don't like surge pricing and get angry during New Year's Eve. So let's take a look at whether surge pricing really delivers the goods. Or taxis. Hey, it's your Uber driver. I've arrived at the place. Ha, just kidding. I was acting. We like to have fun around here. There are 2 main justifications for surge pricing. Firstly, higher prices mean people who want a cab more will get it, as they're willing to pay more. Taxis will go to people who really need them. Second, higher prices mean higher wages for drivers. Surge pricing will call forth more drivers so more people can get cabs. The total supply of cabs is increased as a result of surge pricing. The first point is about the demand side of the economy and the second is about the supply side. So let's take each of these in turn, starting with the demand side. I want to introduce the concept of willingness to pay. Economic theory assumes each person has a certain maximum amount that they will pay for, say, a taxi. This is their willingness to pay, or WTP. Imagine we have 10 people and each of them has a different WTP. Person 1 is willing to pay £19 for a taxi into the city centre. Person 2 is willing to pay £18. Person 3 is willing to pay £17. And so on until person 10, who is willing to pay £10. If we line up these people in reverse order of their WTP, we get a number of points. We can join these together to see how many customers will buy a taxi at each price. For example, at £15, 5 people will get a taxi because 5 people are willing to pay at least £15. The line is downward sloping because as the price falls, more people are willing to buy a taxi. In other words, a lower price means a higher quantity of taxis used. If you know a little bit about economics, you will recognize this as the demand curve. Put a pin in this because we're going to come back to it in a bit. Surge pricing rations based on willingness to pay. The idea is that this will allocate taxis to people who really need them. As one Vox article on the subject states,
if Uber and Lyft charge the same rates on New Year's Eve as they did on a typical night, the result would be people facing long waits to get home. Indeed, that's how things worked in major cities in the pre-Uber world. When you tried to take a cab home from your post-New Year's bash, you'd find that all available cars were taken. Surge pricing addresses this problem by setting prices high enough to bring supply and demand in balance, ensuring that you can always get a ride if you're willing to pay enough.
There's definitely some truth in this. If you consider getting a frivolous taxi and see surge pricing, you might reconsider. The taxi can go to somebody who simply wanted it more, or needed it more. One issue with this, though, is that willingness to pay depends on ability to pay. Rich people can pay more for things because they have more money. You may hypothetically be willing to pay £2,000 for a ticket to see Taylor Swift, if you have any taste at all and access to your basic faculties. But you can't pay that money because you don't have it. If this seems like an obvious point, that's because it is. If you simply cannot afford to get a taxi, ability to pay might seem important. The aforementioned Vox article does acknowledge this, but treats it as secondary. I'd argue that it's central and raises the question of how else we might allocate taxis. Traditionally, humanity has a way of rationing scarce resources that doesn't favour the rich. It's called, wait for it, a queue. Traditional taxi ranks would have people wait their turn. The price of the taxis didn't change based on how many were in the queue. Economists tend to dislike queues which they see as costs. Firstly, as a British person, I'm legally obliged to point out that this ignores all the fun of queuing.
Now I can't stand in line anymore.
It strikes me as odd to see queuing as just a cost. Paying is also a cost, but willingness to pay is considered a measure of how much people value something. Could you not also consider someone's willingness to wait in line a measure of how much they want to do it? Like queuing up for a really good roller coaster at Alton Towers? Don't get me wrong, poorly designed systems can lead to long queues. These are at best tedious and at worst dangerous if, to pluck an example out of thin air, the queue is for healthcare. But that doesn't make rationing based on price automatically the best solution. As the philosopher Michael Sandel puts it,
"The ethic of the queue, first come, first served, has an egalitarian appeal. It bids us to ignore privilege, power, and deep pockets, at least for certain purposes. Wait your turn, we were admonished as children. Don't cut in line."
Queuing is a great equalizer. It doesn't matter who you are, you get in line the same as everyone else. It may be temporarily inconvenient, but you know you will get there. With surge pricing, richer people get to the front of the line instantly. This displaces all of the inconvenience and frustration onto poorer people. The queue isn't really gone, it's just that poor people are in it permanently. We don't regard this as fair and for good reason. Queuing spreads out a little bit of inconvenience and frustration onto everyone. That way, it can just simmer under the surface, like the British have for hundreds of years. If pushed, economists will just say that inequality between rich and poor should be dealt with by other means than taxi prices. We'll discuss that later. For now, just remember that queues mean everyone has an equal opportunity to get a cab. Surge pricing means a whole group of people have no chance at all. Before we discuss the supply side of Uber taxis, I want to talk to you about today's sponsor. Ground News was developed by a former NASA engineer and lets you compare articles from more than 50,000 sources around the world. And for every story you can see bias, factuality and ownership ratings for the news outlets reporting. These ratings come from 3 different news monitoring organisations, and while bias can be difficult to rate, as we all know, it gives a pretty good way to compare coverage. This is important because the same facts can be presented in completely different ways depending on who is presenting them. I can even curate my own newsfeed by following specific people, places, or topics that I'm most interested in, like Uber. For instance, their drivers recently staged a strike in New York after they were denied a pay rise. Remember strikes because we'll return to them shortly. I've been using Ground News for a while and it's the main place I get my news. I really do recommend it. You can use the link in the description, which is ground.news/Unlearning Economics, to get 15% off a subscription. In Neil Stephenson's dystopian masterpiece Snow Crash, America has declined. The country retains its advantages in only a few areas, one of them high-speed delivery. The protagonist, whose name is Hero Protagonist, delivers pizzas. One of the features of Hero's car is a highly visible display counting down the time from the 30-minute maximum delivery time. If the time is breached, there are consequences, and I mean that in the Sopranos sense. The pizza company is intertwined with the mafia, and the fate of drivers who deliver in over 30 minutes is unknown. The pizzas rest, a short stack of them, in slots behind the deliverator's head. Each pizza glides into a slot like a circuit board into a computer, clicks into place as the smartboard interfaces with the onboard system of the deliverator's car. The address of the caller has already been inferred from his phone number and poured into the smart box's built-in RAM. From there, it is communicated to the car, which computes and projects the optimal route on a heads-up display. A glowing coloured map traced out against the windshield so that the deliverator does not even have to glance down. If the 30-minute deadline expires, news of the disaster is flashed to Cosa Nostra Pizza headquarters and relayed from there to Uncle Enzo himself, the Sicilian Colonel Sanders, the Andy Griffith of Bezenhurst, the straight razor-swinging figment of many a deliverator's nightmares, the capo and prime figurehead of Cosa Nostra Pizza Incorporated, who will be on the phone to the customer within 5 minutes, apologising profusely. Let's turn to the supply side of taxis. Does surge pricing encourage Uber drivers to enter the market, increasing supply? The standard theory assumes that drivers have a choice between work and leisure. The wage offered by work has to be enough to coax them away from their sofas. The higher their wages, the more drivers will be willing to work. At a wage of £10, there will be one driver on the road. At a wage of £11, there will be two. At a wage of £19, there will be 10. If we order these drivers, we get an upward sloping curve. Many will recognise this as the supply curve from Economics 101. Surge pricing means that customers pay more to drivers, so their wages are higher. Higher wages induce more drivers onto the road. Now, if we combine the supply curve with our demand curve from earlier, we get the market for taxis. Where supply crosses demand is where the market settles. There are 5 customers who are willing to pay the going rate of £15. There are 5 drivers who are willing to drive them for £15. Surge pricing is supposed to produce a perfect harmony in the market for taxis. If supply and demand are out of whack somehow, the price will change to bring them back into line. But the question remains, does a higher wage actually encourage more drivers? A study by Chen and Sheldon went into depth on this question. They looked at Uber drivers' probability of stopping work. They found that surge pricing reduced this probability, keeping drivers on the road longer. Higher prices meant higher wages for the drivers, which meant drivers stayed on. During my PhD, I actually wrote a mock referee report on this study. I'm sure the authors will be pleased to know that the imaginary journal of a random first-year PhD student would have accepted their paper. It's undoubtedly a great paper, and currently has hundreds of citations. They have internal Uber data on 25 million trips, which allows them to apply advanced statistical methods. The study therefore eliminates almost any confounding influence you could imagine. It concludes convincingly that surge pricing does induce drivers to work more during peak periods. But as I noted in my report, the paper doesn't quite refute the main counter theory. Do drivers have a I think I said drivers instead of Uber drivers. Do Uber drivers have a target income, and if so, do they reach it? This might sound a bit random, but it's actually a big debate in this literature. Taxi drivers may work up until they hit a target for the day, then stop. This seems natural. After all, most people won't work all of their waking hours, no matter how high their pay is. People have needs like food and obligations like rent. A target income for the day may be a way to ensure that they meet these needs by working a sufficient amount. They can then do something else with their time. If the income targeting hypothesis is true, higher pay from surge pricing could make drivers stop faster. Surge pricing would then reduce the supply of taxi drivers, completely contrary to Uber's philosophy, and contradicting the standard supply curve we just saw, which doesn't feature income targeting. Chen and Sheldon even mention this in the abstract and acknowledge that it would undermine surge pricing. However, they dismiss this possibility because the CUM fares, that stands for cumulative fares? You know, fares that build up over a long shift and then have to be spent everywhere. According to the paper, the cumulative fares a driver has earned so far actually have a negative effect on the likelihood an Uber driver will stop. In other words, the more they've cumulatively earned, the more likely they are to continue. That's actually not consistent with a target, where earning more may make them stop once they've reached said target. So the income targeting hypothesis is incorrect, right? Well, The hypothesis does not say that workers never work more when they're earning more. It says they work more until they reach their target. If your target for the day is $1 million, then it's basically irrelevant. You'll never reach it, and the more you earn in a day, the more you'll work, as they find in the study. If your target for the day is $100, then you'll probably reach it every day. With surge pricing on New Year's Eve, you might even make it in just one trip. Your behavior is different when you're above versus when you're below your target. In my Fate referee report, I noted that Uber drivers could generally be earning below their target. If that's the case, they will work more when they earn more, as if their target were $1 million. But they still have an income target, it's just higher than they can feasibly reach, because their pay is so low. In 2019, Uber drivers held an international strike over low pay and long hours, among other things. This seems like evidence that their pay may be lower than they'd like. Now, I don't want to poison the well here, but the paper was written by two economists at Uber. I'd venture that they were somewhat unwilling to confront this issue. To sum up, surge pricing may increase the number of drivers in a world where the drivers need the money, but once they don't need the money, it may not be so effective in coaxing them away from their sofas. It's difficult to tell from this paper because they don't do the income targeting hypothesis justice. The better papers in this literature are more explicit about finding out what the driver's income targets are, but that's just absent from the Chen and Sheldon study. There are some further technicalities surrounding this which I can put in the description. However, let's ignore everything I've just said. Assume Chen and Sheldon are right and surge pricing increases the supply of drivers. We still shouldn't jump for joy. You've probably seen economists state that they only describe how the world works. An especially arrogant example came from Levitt and Dubner in Freakonomics.
Relative to the size of the black population, lynchings were exceedingly rare.
Oh, sorry. Not that Freakonomics quote. I meant this one.
Morality, it could be argued, represents the way that people would like the world to work, whereas economics represents how it actually does work.
In the business we call this econo-brain, and it's sufficient grounds to reject somebody on Bumble. There are lots of subtle ways the statement is wrong, but I want to focus on a direct one. When economists are literally designing policies, they are determining how the world works based on their theories. Their ideas are being put into practice.
Of course, what do you think? They already put my ideas into practice.
Surge pricing in taxis, for example, did not exist before, but now it does. Ideas from economics are shaping the economy itself. As one article put it,
economists love Uber because it's the closest you can get to taking the pure economic theory of textbooks and summoning it to life. Uber created a massive open market, governed first and foremost by the forces of supply and demand. Along the way, it broke up the taxi monopoly, taught people to accept surge pricing, and ushered concepts long confined to Econ 101 into the popular discourse.
Uber heavily employs economists, and they even have a little group called Ubernomics. Demand and supply come to represent not just a description, but an aspiration for how markets should work. At Uber, they've created a market which works according to these principles, much more so than others which preceded it. People used to queue when demand outstrips supply for taxis. Now the price rises, much more in line with the demand-supply model. Hey, remember when we discussed that Chen and Sheldon study about how surge pricing encourages drivers to continue driving? I raised objections in my Fate referee report, but again, let's assume they're right. Surge pricing increases the supply of drivers. This is likely because Uber uses a wide range of psychological tricks specifically to make drivers continue working. As one study puts it,
According to a New York Times article, top officials at Uber and Lyft have certainly concluded that many of their drivers set income goals. Others are motivated by an income target for sure, said Brian Hsu, the Life Vice President in charge of supply. Employing hundreds of social scientists and data scientists, Uber has a long tradition to solve practical problems by using psychological inducements and other techniques of behavioral economics. Uber has alleviated the issue of income targeting by setting new income goals. Drivers are alerted that they are close to hitting a new target when they try to log off. More specifically, when Uber drivers try to log off and reach their original income targets, many of them receive a message on the Uber app with the headline, "Make it to $XXX." The text then explains, "You're XX dollars away from making XXX in net earnings. Are you sure you want to go offline?" Below are two prompts: go offline and keep driving. The latter is highlighted. Essentially, Uber tries to alleviate the issue of income targeting by setting a new, higher income target to replace the driver's original income targets.
Holy fuck. It's clear these companies know that drivers probably have income targets. They actively try to keep them on the treadmill by increasing their targets. The result is that drivers are always below their target because it's always rising, just out of reach. The quoted study looks at the behavior on a ride-sharing platform in China. This platform doesn't use the same tricks to keep its drivers on. The study finds that riders do reach a target income, then stop. This shows the importance of understanding context and not just looking at the USA. Can't wait for that decline. Speaking of which, remember hero Protagonist from Snow Crash, who had to deliver pizzas in under 30 minutes? 30 years ago, when the book was written, the prominent timer in the car was considered a horrible dystopian prediction. But this is worse, right? The numbers in Uber don't just count up to a fixed amount, they move around. Drivers are engaged in a Sisyphean task, an expression I use in almost every video I make. Maybe my unconscious is telling me something about YouTube. I cannot overstate how much the Uber model attempts to turn a real market into the basic Econ 101 supply and demand model. Whether deliberately or otherwise, I'm not saying it's some kind of conspiracy, I'm just saying it's happened. So, do prices not rise when demand rises? Force them to with an algorithm. Do drivers not work more when their wages increase? Manipulate them into doing so with psychological tricks.
Mr. McClure, I have a crazy friend who says it's wrong to surge price. Is he crazy?
No, just ignorant. You see, your crazy friend never heard of the economy.
Look, surge pricing isn't all bad. My point in this video is not to pretend it has no benefits whatsoever. I've no doubt that it has deterred people from getting frivolous taxis and allocated the taxi to someone who needed it. I'm also sure that many Uber drivers like their flexibility, for instance those with children or caring responsibilities. But the practice prompts us to ask broader questions about prices and wages. You know how you used to go to a shop, stay with me here, and buy some bread? Just stay with me. And the bread would be the same price for everybody in the shop because there would be a label on the shelf with the price on it. Okay, let's just take a breather after that. In his book End State, James Plunkett notes that this situation wasn't ideal for making the most money.
Apple pie in itself doesn't have a price. Instead, the price is a feature of your individual relationship with the pie within the wider context of the economy. Are you feeling greedy? Did you just get paid? Or is this the end of a tight month? Is a crying child hanging off your arm, stressing you out? That 1 shilling price tag is still about the apples, pie baking, and transport. But it's also about you. And for the restaurateurs and the shopkeepers, that idea creates a tantalizing prospect. What if they could find out the maximum price you'd be willing to pay at that precise point in time and charge you that instead?
This is becoming a reality. Surge pricing is just a specific version of the more general practice of dynamic pricing, changing prices over time and for different individuals based on context. Companies try to charge more to consumers with the highest willingness to pay. Prices can be tailored to individuals, demographics, internet histories, even personalities can feed into the prices you see. Now, Uber are not very transparent about surge pricing, but dynamic pricing uses even more information, while companies are even less transparent. These days, we actually inhabit our own little price bubbles online. We see different prices and options to everyone else, something people sometimes don't realize. Two people sitting side by side on a plane could have paid vastly different prices for their seats. This is a far cry from the egalitarian ethic of the queue. The reasons behind dynamic pricing can be fair. We're not too bothered when airlines change prices over the week to charge business travellers more and holidayers less. But we are bothered when plane prices rise by 600% after a hurricane. When people are desperate, when they have no real choice, it seems unfair and exploitative to raise their prices, to extract resources out of the vulnerable who probably have fewer resources in the first place. Plunkett recounts the following story.
In January 2018, Mohammed Butt was shopping for insurance. He'd applied online, but then he realized with frustration that he'd put his middle name, Suleiman, in the first name box by mistake. He called the company to change the information, correcting his name to Mohammed. And then something strange happened. The price jumped by £200. As he learned later, the insurance company's algorithm associated the name Mohammed with high-risk claimants. Suleiman, it seemed, hadn't been identified in the same way by the company's systems.
The effect was replicated by a journalist who found more systematically that the name Mohammed led to much higher car insurance prices. Names weren't the only factor. People with Hotmail addresses were also charged more, and rightly so. It's no secret that people often do not like dynamic pricing, but one counterpoint is that this price discrimination has always been with us. If I see this point in the comments, I'll know you haven't watched the whole video, like most of my critics. But it actually gives us a chance to explore why people find dynamic pricing so distasteful. Groups like the old and young, loyal customers, or those with special needs have received discounts for decades, maybe even centuries. The counterpart of this is that normal customers are probably surge priced most of the time, even in supermarkets. They have to pay more because these other groups get a discount. So, is dynamic pricing just the computer age version of these practices which have been around for so long? Well, no. There are features of dynamic pricing that people don't like, and for good reason. These features are not present in traditional examples of price discrimination. Traditional discounts can go to groups who need them. We accept that young people and old people often have less income than working age people. We can understand that discounts for young people, for example rail cards, are a way of investing in the future. For older people, we can see that they have worked and contributed their entire lives and now they're entitled to some benefits. Benefits such as travelling on British Rail. We may even accept that brands can reward loyal customers because it guarantees them a revenue stream. These pricing practices are all transparent. We can see the reasons, and not only that, we tend to agree with them. I stress the tend. Price discrimination by rail companies has fueled political discontent in the past, something we'll return to shortly. Actively bargaining for better prices has an even longer history. We appreciate the effort and skill that goes into this bargaining.
You familiar with that face?
I don't know. My memory ain't so great.
Oh, yeah? Maybe this'll refresh your memory.
I don't know, it's still kind of hazy.
How about this?
Yeah, I remember him. I used to see him around. Why do you want to know?
I can't tell you that.
Well, maybe this'll help.
I really don't think I should.
Yeah, you still don't think so?
All right, his name is Nordberg. He's a cop.
I wouldn't consider myself especially skilled in this regard. I'm pretty awkward. But I once got a pair of shorts in Thailand down to a fraction of the asking price simply because I had no other choice. I'd run out of money but needed some shorts. I literally tried to walk out of the shop multiple times and they lowered the price every time. This pantomime was partly born out of necessity. I couldn't afford the asking price. But it was also sociable and actually created goodwill between me and the sellers. Other customers were even laughing along at how exaggerated the whole process was. Or maybe it was because I had no shorts on. These social features are simply absent from dynamic pricing. It is automatic, opaque, impersonal, indiscriminate. The type of negotiation and communication that are the hallmark of being human are gone entirely. Now you might say that people are free to make their own choices, but the available choices are determined by factors outside an individual's control. Choices are always made in a context, and that context has been determined by the pricing strategies of modern companies. If we change these strategies, we change the available choices, and could improve things. This leads us to ask the broader question of whether we are happy with a world marked by increased volatility in prices and in wages. Surge pricing assumes that customers and drivers are a bit better behaved than they are. In fact, what economists call well-behaved preferences basically means preferences which lack everything that would make somebody noticeably human. It's no secret that Uber's surge pricing creates a lot of anger. Almost every article you read on the topic mentions events like New Year's Eve. But there's a tendency to treat these as incidental and even to patronize the customers. Consider this quote from Tim Harford, the undercover economist.
But customer acceptance may be more of a problem. You're almost at their mercy because you don't want to wait longer for a cab, one disgruntled customer told the Houston Chronicle after being charged $247.5, £203, for a 21-kilometer, 13-mile, ride in Houston, Texas. Although, it's worth pointing out he chose to pay so much because he couldn't bear to wait for a cheaper journey.
Hey, it's worth pointing out that maybe he had no fucking choice or feared that the price might go even higher. The undercover economist, more like the underwhelming economist. Got him. Behavioral economists have known for a long time that people have a preference for fairness.
So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber.
Consumer and worker anger is often anger at the choices presented to them. When people don't think their available options are fair, they complain, protest, strike, boycott, and so on. Pointing out that they still might make the best choice out of the ones they have misses the point entirely. As I mentioned earlier, price discrimination can fuel discontent. US rail companies in the late 19th century placed the poor in horrific carriages for a lower fare. They also charged different businesses, farmers, and cities different amounts. Unhappiness with these practices led to the campaigns, which culminated in the first permanent regulatory commission in the United States. There is a similar sense of uncertainty, alienation, and exploitation created by this new type of price discrimination. One of the features of the world our parents, and especially their parents, grew up in was relative stability. Much of this stability was won by the type of populist movements we saw in the late 19th century. These protections were dismantled in the 70s and 80s. Now, many of us can no longer rely on predictable prices, which is frustrating and unfair. Workers in the so-called gig economy are especially affected. It's not just the things they buy, but their take-home incomes that jump around. Don't get me wrong, there are bigger trends leading to modern work insecurity than just dynamic pricing and surge pricing. But evaluated narrowly, it's not clear that the volatility introduced by these practices is a good thing. Fortunately, there may be a solution which helps us all. Let's recap. Uber's surge pricing algorithm is supposed to have numerous benefits. On the demand side, it allocates taxi rides to those who are most willing to pay. Willingness to pay is taken to reflect how much someone needs the taxi. But this ignores ability to pay, and that surge pricing will favour richer people, as a rule. On the supply side, higher prices mean higher wages for drivers in surge periods. This should induce more drivers onto the road, and there is some evidence for this. But there is also evidence that drivers may just reach a target income then quit. This would undermine the claim that higher earnings means more drivers. Uber seems to manipulate drivers' targets to keep them on the road. There is a lack of understanding that this attempt to turn the world into a supply and demand diagram may have unseen costs. Costs like political anger at an economic system characterized by exploitation, insecurity, and a lack of predictability. This is underscored by the general spread of so-called dynamic pricing, which can even result in outright racist pricing practices against certain groups. If you remember from earlier, I said that economists will acknowledge that surge pricing benefits richer consumers, but they'll then put issues of inequality to one side as something to be solved by politics. Uber is not the best place to think about redistribution, or so the argument goes. If we want a fairer economy, then we just need to make sure the whole income distribution is more egalitarian. Eliminating surge pricing will help a few poorer people who want a taxi, but redistributing income will help all poorer people. Here's the thing. And brace yourselves. I kind of agree with the economists. Don't get me wrong, I'm not a fan of loose appeals to some imagined redistribution as a distraction from talking about the problems with surge pricing. If it's a problem, it needs direct attention. We should apply regulation to Uber and to other dynamic pricing. There's a case that dynamic pricing can violate antitrust laws by gouging consumers. There's a case that it can violate anti-discrimination practices, as with Mohammed Butt. A basic regulation would be to limit just how high prices can go and how fast they can change. These limits would give people predictability, at least. We also need to make sure drivers and passengers are properly protected by safety regulations that apply elsewhere in the sector. The UK recently enacted laws recognising Uber drivers as employees, which is a step in the right direction. More broadly, we can look at breaking tech companies up so they can't exploit their monopoly power and gouge consumers. We can look at unionising drivers so they get fair pay and conditions. Having the drivers seize the tech companies. Establishing socialism. Just small incremental reforms. Yet, I wouldn't want to ban dynamic pricing outright. For a start, I have an inclination against bans as they tend to create weird behaviours and drive things underground. If we ban Uber from surge pricing, I'm not sure what they'll do next, but I don't think I'll like it. Some of the issues with dynamic pricing could be minimised with good regulation. This includes transparency and a whole host of considerations surrounding information and privacy that I haven't been able to touch in this video. But in a sense, the economists are right. I can't escape the feeling these practices are worse in a more unequal society. If some people have much more income than others, it can become more profitable to jack prices up and just serve richer customers. Reducing top incomes will reduce the highest surge price that can feasibly make Uber money. A more egalitarian income distribution may help us to reap the benefits of surge pricing where possible. And I mean really egalitarian, like beyond Sweden in the 70s egalitarian. If people have similar incomes, then ability to pay is not such a deciding factor. Willingness to pay becomes relevant again. A robust social safety net would also provide a predictable base of income. Think of Denmark. The Danish flexicurity system has long combined light regulations with a generous welfare state. It's easy to hire and fire workers, though not as easy as in the US, which also doesn't have a robust social safety net. Gotta love that decline. But Danish workers have income security from the state. They have access to job training, which helps them change careers if they want to. Such a system would constrain the ability of companies to fluctuate wages and prices unfairly. People would have better means and the outside options of welfare, as well as other jobs. A more equal income distribution would mean more access at different price levels. Uber drivers wouldn't be kept on the treadmill by economic necessity, only by psychological manipulation. I know I said we shouldn't ban stuff, but actually ban that shit. And this is before I even get into what a better transportation system could look like. Now, this is just a thumbnail sketch of how to deal with the problem. My next video is going to look at free stuff and welfare in more depth. Overall, surge pricing and dynamic pricing try to create a world where supply and demand are more closely matched. Using predictive algorithms, economists, computer scientists, and the companies they work for are conspiring to squeeze every last ounce of willingness to pay out of us and every last drop of willingness to work out of us. This does have some benefits, but it conflicts with other goals such as fairness and security. These practices have been designed deliberately, and so they could be changed. After all, the question is not just whether these assumptions are accurate, it's whether we want them to be.
Hello everybody, thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. It was a little bit shorter than usual, as you may have noticed. Still not really short, but as short as I can make them. And it was almost a lot longer because there's a massive rabbit hole about Uber drivers and the research done on whether they enjoy their jobs and whether their jobs are good for them, which I could have gone down, which was really interesting. But anyway, yeah. Thanks to all my patrons, and thank you to my producer, Hobbie, and to my animator, Grim. And yeah, I hope you all have a great new year, and I'll see you next time.